Thank you very much. My job is to talk about the economy, the South African economy, or what's left of it, the international economic environment, and maybe a few comments what you should be doing with your money. We've just listened to the grey listing stuff, and usually when you look at some other countries that have been grey listed, that usually goes with some downgrading as well. So we are currently a junk, as you know, but it's possible to go junker and junkster. So we can go even further down. All right, so I think we're going to start off what's going on internationally. It's important to understand what is some of those important trends internationally. Because South Africa is a small, open economy, and whatever happens internationally will affect the South African economy. So I'm going to touch on a few things that are currently happening internationally. One is, for example, the war in Ukraine. We know that there's a war going on. This war is having a huge impact, not so much anymore, but it used to have a huge impact on commodity prices, as an example. And I think this war is going to go on for a very long time. I think chances are that we will have a more polarized world going forward. We can already see that. The world is gradually moving into two major camps. Let's call the one the West and the other one the East, if you like to. And from a political point of view, it's very important for South Africa to position ourselves correctly here. I have sympathy with the position of neutrality by the South African government. I think that is a correct approach, but if you want to be neutral, you have to be really neutral. And going on exercises with the Chinese and the Russians, military exercises, that's certainly not projecting a neutral position. So that is a conflict that is probably going to go on for a very long time. I'm also concerned that this conflict can accelerate and get into something really big. And recently, again, we've been hearing about the possibility of nuclear weapons being moved around and all that. So this can eventually escalate into something really bad, into a third world war. But the most likely scenario at this stage is for this war to go on for a very long period of time. And of course, every now and again, it will have a disruptive impact on commodity prices, like energy prices, an example, but also food prices as well. Keep in mind, there's another potential conflict in the world, and that is around Taiwan. I think the Chinese are playing a wait-and-see game. Xi Jinping, the president of China, he wants his legacy to be that he was the man that united China. And that means basically to take over Taiwan. And again, in the East also you get this polarization happening. Some countries like, for example, Malaysia and Indonesia and India and Australia and especially Japan are all sort of polarizing around the Western bloc of countries mostly. On the other hand, you have then, of course, the Chinese and the Russians on the other side. Keep in mind that people are not aware of this always. But in the late 1800s, there was a conflict between the Chinese and the Russians, and it ended with a peace accord in which the Chinese ceded large chunks of China to Russia. And the Chinese are still not happy about that, and I will not be surprised if the Chinese will wait for a weakened Russia to take over some territorial areas of Russia. Areas like, for example, Mongolia, which is an independent country, and the eastern part round about Kamchatka and the city of Vladivostok, for example. Those are areas that I think that the Chinese may eventually eye. So, but for a moment, the Chinese and the Russians are projected to be one force, equal partners, which they certainly are not, while the rest, under leadership of the Americans, is the other bloc, basically. So that's the political situation internationally. A few other things that are happening, and that is how various economies are performing internationally. Let's start with the Chinese. Now, the Chinese economy was the driving force behind global economic growth for many decades, something like 30 years or so. And the result of that was that many hundreds of millions of Chinese were lifted out of abject poverty the last 30, 40 years. That was indeed an economic miracle. Now, there are many reasons why the Chinese economy started doing very well. One is that they started accepting free market principles under Deng Xiaoping, yes. And that was in 1979. And the result of that was strong economic growth. But there was another reason why the Chinese economy excelled the last 30 years. And that was because of the composition of the population, their demographics. Now, during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, The Chinese had a lot of workers, relatively few old people because they killed a lot in the 1960s, and relatively few children, especially during the 80s and the 90s. And the reason for that was because of their one-child policy, which has been abandoned since then. So you had this large bulge of potential workers in the middle, few old people, few young people, so few dependents, and that also supported economic growth in China to a large extent. So it's called a demographic dividend. Now, what has happened since then is that the Chinese population has been getting older, so this population dividend has washed through their economy. And what we see today, for the first time since 1960, this year, the Chinese population will start falling. So population growth in China is actually negative today, which is very, very interesting because the Chinese, despite this amazing economic performance the past couple of decades, that China is still a poor country. That is an interesting thing, interesting phenomenon. If you stand back and you look at economies and populations and how they evolve over time, you will find as countries get richer, their population initially will start growing. Then as they get richer still, population growth will slow down. And once they've become wealthy, then you will find that population growth goes into negative. And there's a proxy that you can use to determine wealth. And I simply use life expectancy as a proxy for wealth. And you will find when life expectancy reach around about 80, 85 years, population growth in that economy goes negative because that is a proxy of wealth. So once they become rich, they become fewer. That's basically the trend. Now, there are two exceptions to that. The one is China. China, before they became wealthy, is actually going into a negative population growth. And that has to do with factors like, for example, the one-child policy. And just interesting, there's another country that is also experiencing the same sort of thing, and that is Russia. So the Russian population today is also in a sharp decline for many reasons, but a very important reason is because of health reasons, because they simply drink themselves to death. The life expectancy of the average Russian man is the same as the life expectancy of the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and that's Haiti. The life expectancy of the average Russian man is the same as the life expectancy of a man in Haiti. All right, so that is important. The Chinese population growth will go negative this year, which means economic growth coming from China is likely to be much more in line with most other advanced economies, because they're becoming an advanced economy, of around about 2, 3, 4%. So forget about 5, 7, 8, 10, 12% in China. That's not going to happen anymore. They're going to go back to a much more realistic rate of economic growth. Another country in the East that I also find very, very interesting, and I think that is going to be the new growth engine in the world, is India. Because again, this year, for the first time ever, the Indian population today is bigger than the Chinese population. The most populous country in the world today is not China anymore, it is India. So I think that economy is really going to shoot out the lights over the next couple of decades because they have this amazing population dividend at the moment as well. Relatively few old people, relatively few kids, and this bulge of potential workers in the middle. So if you want to put your money somewhere, find a way to invest in India. That economy is really going to kick ass. Unfortunately, it's not that easy to invest in India for some practical reasons, but you can get access to India, for example, and that's what we do, invest in, say, typically Japanese companies that do business with the Indians. So there's an indirect way of getting some of the benefits from Indian economic growth. Some other economies in the world, the European economies are slowing down quite significantly. And the reason for that, well, many countries are slowing down in terms of economic growth, is because of this increase in inflation internationally. When inflation goes up, central banks increase interest rates. When they increase interest rates, financial markets don't like that, and economies do not like that either. And that leads to a slowdown in demand and slower economic growth. So in the process of trying to get inflation, to bring down inflation, central banks are increasing interest rates, and of course that is hurting economic growth globally. And it's leading to all sorts of other things. Like, for example, in America, we find that some of the banks are in trouble. So let's just look at a couple of economies. The European economy is likely to slow down quite a lot, but I do not expect the Europeans to dip into a recession, but to slow down quite a lot. Maybe we're talking about 1% perhaps, a slightly higher economic growth in Europe, in the European Union. For the UK economy is in a deep recession, and it's unlikely that we're going to see much in terms of economic growth coming from Britain soon. So that economy is in a very deep recession. The most important one in the West, of course, is the United States. I think, well, we've been predicting a recession in the United States for many months now. It's still not happening yet, but there is a possibility that the US economy can dip into a recession. But at the moment, for what is happening at the moment is, despite very high levels of interest rates and increasing levels of interest rates, they keep on creating more jobs. In America, while the inflation rate is hardly bulging. So I think what is going to happen, inflation is going to slow down a little bit in the United States. That's very important to us, because if they increase interest rates, the dollar goes up. If the dollar goes up, other stuff goes down, like the rand, for example. So the American economy is doing very, very well, and the American central bank will keep on increasing interest rates until something breaks. Now, one or two things are supposed to break. One is inflation must come down significantly before they stop increasing interest rates. And the other one is they have to stop creating all these jobs. They're creating 350,000 jobs every month. And that means that there's underlying growth potential in the American economies. They will keep on increasing interest rates until they can see one of these two things break. In the meantime, something else broke, and that's the banks. So the banks in the US economy are coming under a lot of pressure, and that means that the Federal Reserve find themselves in this awkward position where they have to keep on increasing interest rates to slow the economy, to slow inflation. But if they keep on increasing that, then the bank's going to get into trouble, and that's going to lead to all sort of problems in the economy as well. So what they've opted for is, instead of increasing interest rates by 50 basis points last week, they went for a 25 basis points. So I think we're getting close to the cycle where interest rates will go up a little bit more in the US, but we're probably reaching the end of that cycle. So by the next second half of this year, we're probably going to see slower interest rates or lower interest rates in the US economy. So that's the world economy. It's a South Africa small open economy, and we found ourselves between the giants internationally, and whatever they do will affect the South African economy as well. Okay, let's have a look at South Africa and talk a little bit about South Africa, and let's start off perhaps with talking about politics. Now, let me just make this comment. We have to understand that we have a government in South Africa that's caused immeasurable damage to the South African economy. It's basically impossible to measure this. I mean, you can't do this. But everywhere you look, where the ANC government is involved in, it's a mess. There are one or two exceptions, but the rule is the ANC government has been a destructive force to the South African economy. I just came back from the platteland. The small little towns in the plattelands are a disaster. It's dirty. It's mismanaged. 70% of the local authorities in South Africa are financially bankrupt. They owe a lot of money to Eskom. They simply cannot afford it. It's become basically a source of income for corrupt ANC cadres. That is what the local authorities are. Not only the local authorities, the same goes for the state-owned enterprises. I call them the parasitals. The parasitals in South Africa, there are nearly 1,000 of them. Just about all of them have been run into the ground operationally and financially. We all know about Eskom as an example, but Eskom is only one exception. Of one example. There are exceptions. Safcoal, for example, the forest company is actually being run quite well, but for most cases, the state-owned enterprises are a mess. It's not only the state-owned enterprises, the local departments as well. The government finances are in a complete and a total mess. And I'll get back to that just now. So just see what the outlook is for politics in South Africa. So next year, we're going to see a general election in South Africa. And now, I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but there are a couple of scenarios, and this is what I think could happen. I think the most likely scenario, I've just read the report this morning, the most likely scenario is for the ANC to get less than 50%, probably between 45 and 50%. If that should happen, and this is important to understand because we are in a phase of political transition in South Africa, and going through this political transition in South Africa will be disruptive. And with a bit of luck, we are at the beginning of the end of the ANC, but it's not going to be smooth sailing. So we're probably going to see the ANC getting 45 to 50% somewhere. If they get between 45 and 50%, then it will be possible for the ANC to go into coalition with the smaller political parties just to get them over 50%. It is possible that the ANC can still get above 50%, but the most likely scenario, say 45 to 50%, meaning that the ANC is still going to be in government with the smaller political parties. Just by the way, my view is that the ANC 45 to 50, the EFF probably around about 10% or slightly less than 10%, and the Democratic Alliance between, say, 20 and 25%. That's more or less what I think that the eventual outcome is going to be. So 45 to 50% for the ANC. Then we talk about coalition with the ANC and the smaller political parties, like, for example, the Good Party and UDM and stuff like that. If the ANC gets below 45%, say 40 to 45%, then we're talking about coalition between the ANC and the EFF. That means in a little more than a year's time, if that is the scenario that plays itself out, your next president is going to be Paul Mashatile, your next deputy president is going to be Julius Malema, just by the way. So if the ANC gets less than 40%, which is not impossible but unlikely, if they get less than 40%, then we may see the opposition political parties coming together and forming an alliance. So what the important point is that we're probably in for a coalition government in South Africa, which in itself will be disruptive, and hugely so. Remember, the ANC sees the state as a source of income, and if you take people's money and their source of income away, they get angry at you. All right, so that is the most likely outcome for the election next year. Coming back to some of those numbers that I think are important for us to understand, and let's look at the fiscal numbers. Now, the Minister of Finance in his budget, let me give you some numbers. The fiscal debt levels in South Africa, that's how much money the state owns. On you and my behalf, by the way. Each one of you own about 70,000 Rand more than what you think you own. Because that's the amount of money that the Minister of Finance borrowed on your behalf. It is your debt, which is equal to a big number. It's about 250,000 million Rand. Okay? Currently, it's about 70%, slightly more than 70% of the economy, depending what you want to include in there. So the debt to GDP ratio at the moment around about 70% to GDP. But the Minister of Finance said this year he's going to run a fiscal deficit of just less than 5% to GDP. And of course, that means he's going to borrow a lot of money and add it to the debt to GDP ratio, which will bring the debt levels up to about 72% or so to GDP. That's what the Minister of Finance said, which of course is not correct. Because he's going to take over a lot of debt of Eskom, and this debt of Eskom will not be included in the fiscal deficit, it will simply be added to the debt levels. So the debt levels will go up to about 73% according to the Minister of Finance. But what he's supposed to be doing is to increase the fiscal deficit with that as well. He did not do that, he simply added that to the debt numbers. And by the way, the IMF picked that up, and they said, no, that's not the way to do this. You're supposed to add it to the debt levels as well. In the meantime, what is happening? Economic growth is slowing down. Now, my expectations for economic growth is that we're probably in a recession already, depending on your definition for a recession. Last quarter of last year was a negative quarter. This quarter, first quarter of this year is probably going to be a negative one as well. And for a year in total, the Reserve Bank expects 0.3% economic growth. The IMF expects 0.1% economic growth, and everybody else are downgrading the expectations in terms of economic growth. So let's talk about around about zero. That's where the economy is going to grow this year. If the economy grows at the rate of even 0.5% or 0% or whatever, it means that that ratio will deteriorate as well. So you've got the deficit and the debt numbers relative to the size of the economy. And since the economy is smaller now, that ratio, debt to GDP, is likely to go up. And if you include everything, and we talk about zero economic growth this year, then the fiscal deficit in South Africa is probably going to be in a region of about 6 or 6.5% or even higher relative to GDP. And that means by the end of the current financial year, next year, we're going to see the debt levels of the state going up to about 75% or maybe even higher. That's in 1 year. It's completely and totally unsustainable. The state must spend less money. We simply cannot, as a taxpayer, as an economy that's hardly growing, we simply cannot afford this massive state anymore. Let me give you some other numbers. We have in South Africa today 18 million people, close to 20 million people that receive an income from the state every month in the form of a grant. So the normal grants, the child support grant and the old age grant and the veteran disability grants and so on, about 20 million people receive that from the state every month. So there are 20 million people. We are 62 million people in South Africa, just by the way. So 20 million people receive a grant from the state every month. 2 years ago, we decided to implement this thing called the COVID grant, 350 rand, a temporary COVID grant. Now, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary state expense item. Okay, so they've increased, and what has happened now, we're running it for the 3rd year in a row. The president and many of the other politicians already indicated that we can't take that away anymore. There are 8 million people receiving this temporary COVID grant. So there are 28 million people receiving an income from the state every month. We have 2 million civil servants in South Africa, which is a funny name, civil servant. Well, anyway, most civil servants in South Africa are overpaid and underworked, and hugely so. Not all of them, but in most cases. Remember, they're very well organized. If they like what the state is offering them, they will go and trash the streets, like they've just done recently. They recently got an increase of 7.5%, where the state simply cannot afford this. But the state, the politicians, of course, they need labor, especially COSATU, because COSATU is part of the Tripartite Alliance, and that's an election next year. So you cannot do the responsible thing. You have to do the politically important thing, and that's to give civil servants an above-inflation increase so that they can vote for you. And there are 2 million of them. So that means there are 33 million people, 30 million people in South Africa, nearly half of the South African population, that gets an income from the state every month. Now, we have 13 million people in South Africa that work in the private sector. 13 million people, and they're the guys funding this thing, mostly. Now, I can give you all the numbers. There are relatively few people funding just about all state expense items. Like, for example, personal income tax is the most important tax revenue for the Minister of Finance. And about 1.6 million individuals in South Africa pay for about more than 2/3 of total, about 80% of total personal income taxes by the Minister of Finance. Okay? We're talking about less than 1.5 million people, roughly, paying for just about all the personal income taxes in the country, out of a population of 62 million. There are 770 companies, less than 1,000 companies in South Africa that pay 2/3 of total company taxes in the country. The point is, the fiscus in South Africa is the most redistributive fiscus in the world. Now, this will not go on, I promise you. So we've reached the end of the redistributional impact of the fiscus. If they try to increase taxes, the collections will come down, and we simply cannot afford to spend more money. Now, that creates a bit of a problem, because we have very high levels of unemployment and poverty, and we have also, very importantly, rising food prices and a coming election. Now, that is a toxic mixture of all sorts of things. And when politicians start running around in the streets and threatening this and that and doing the other, small spark can get this whole thing going. And I'm very concerned about public violence, something like we saw 2 years ago in South Africa. That is my biggest concern. And all political leaders and social leaders and the religious leaders all have to be aware that there's a social tension in South Africa that can go horribly wrong. Okay, so that's where we found ourselves in South Africa. There are 1 or 2 highlights. Maybe I can just touch on 1 or 2 of them in a way. The South African Reserve Bank, under the leadership of Loadshedding Kanyago, is doing an excellent job. Now, they're increasing interest rates recently, and tomorrow they're going to increase interest rates again, I hope. They're probably going to go for another 25 basis points. They would have gone for a 50 now, but because of what's happening internationally, probably going to go for another 25 or so. And that is going to cause even more damage to the South African economy. Increases in interest rates are bad for the economy. It slows economic growth down. It is painful. It is a blunt instrument. But that's all we have left. The Reserve Bank are the guys that need to catch the ball when everybody else dropped the ball. And government has dropped the ball in South Africa. Because the government's job is to create a competitive environment where everybody wants to do business, where you can feel safe, where private property rights are protected, where we have effective and efficient government machinery or state service government machinery in South Africa. We don't have none of those. And since we don't have that, the result of that is that we have a very uncompetitive economic environment in South Africa, meaning that inflation prices or prices can increase to where they are currently, meaning that the Reserve Bank hasn't got the choice but to use this blunt instrument called interest rates, trying to get inflation lower. So yes, it is causing damage to the economy, but that's all that we have left. And fortunately, the Reserve Bank has started relatively early in the cycle, Because if they haven't started early in the cycle by increasing interest rates, inflation in South Africa would have been more of a problem, and that would have meant that we would have had to increase interest rates by much more, causing even more pain to the economy. So Loadshedding Dawie doing an excellent job in South Africa, and I think we all need to support in his attempt to get inflation lower as well. So that's one, in a way, silver lining. Another one is the appointment of Raymond Zondo as the Chief Justice. I think that was an excellent decision by the President. He does not make many good decisions. Look, for example, at the last cabinet composition, the shaking up of cabinet, nothing really happened there. So we've got a president that's not really a leader. He's more of a consensus seeker. But his decision on appointing Raymond Zondo, I think, was an excellent example. And then, perhaps in a weird kind of way, this government in South Africa is doing the most amazing thing, but because they are privatizing everything. Now, of course, we've got a government that's a left-leaning government. They talk about comrades and exploitation, and developmental state, and all that sort of pink nonsense. But and they got stuck somewhere in the 1920s. They're a bunch of ideologues, a bunch of communists, and so on. But there's one thing that they're doing. Because of the incompetence of this government, they stopped providing services. And there are many examples of that. Eskom, the latest example. South African Airways is a good one. What's currently happening to the post office is a good one. I mean, the post office has just stopped functioning. It stopped working. It's just dying. And the same is going to happen to Eskom, the private sector stay, and that's creating opportunities for the private sector. Unfortunately, at a very high cost, and it would have been so much better. And there's no official policy to privatize anything in South Africa. But Margaret Thatcher would have been proud of what the ANC's government is doing, because they're bringing the state to an end. The state is simply dying in South Africa, which in a way is a good thing. Unfortunately, I said the price is very dear that we have to pay for that. Maybe just one or two other comments. And what should you do with your money? Now, the problem is that we've got guys like the Financial Action Task Force that keep an eye on how we do business in South Africa and other places. Unfortunately, I say that because, of course, people that get involved in terrorism financing or criminality or whatever, they should be brought to book. But for the rest of us, we just want to take our money and diversify it internationally. And we don't want to pay taxes to a government that's highly inefficient and corrupt, basically, in South Africa. But it's not that easy because of all these rules and regulations. But still, I really advise people to make sure that a substantial portion of your investments are investment abroad, of your portfolio is invested abroad, and make sure that, of course, that you don't break any laws, make sure you follow the right procedures and so on, but make sure a substantial part of your portfolio is invested abroad. There are many reasons for that. Of course, it's risky in South Africa, but there's another reason. There are simply more opportunities internationally. There are more companies to invest in internationally. Doesn't mean you have to take all your money out. We still need to live in South Africa. And talking about that, people ask me, so should I send my kids out of the country? Should I immigrate? I think that's the wrong question. The right answer is, what you need to try to achieve is, you look at how economies evolved over time and where economic activities are taking place today in South Africa, but globally, is that most economic activities are taking place in that area of the economy where you guys are involved in. That's a service part of the economy. It's a digital part of the economy. It's the tertiary part of the economy. And in fact, all modern economies are becoming more, let's call it digitizable, more technologically driven. All of them, even the primary industries like agriculture and mining, they've got drones, they've got genetic engineering, they've got precision farming, all that sort of stuff. That's all part of the tertiary part of the economy. So the real answer and what you should be doing is the following. South Africa is a dangerous place. We are physical beings. So what you need to do is that you have to make sure that you are safe. Look after yourself, look after your family, and make sure that you are physically safe. The second thing that you need to do is that you have to, and this is very important, make sure that you have the necessary skills, not qualifications, because we've got this overemphasis on qualifications in South Africa. Skills that matters. Make sure you have the necessary skills to participate in this wonderful service industry, this wonderful tertiary part of the economy. The third thing, make sure you've got a proper computer, the necessary hardware. And the last thing is make sure that you have proper internet. Once you've got that, you can be part of the modern economy. It doesn't matter where you are. We've got nice steak in South Africa, nice brandy in South Africa. Stay here. But you don't need to work here. As long as you've got the connection and the necessary skills, you can work anywhere in the world. A friend of mine, he works for a bank in Kenya, and he's never even been to Kenya, for example. He's all over the place in South Africa, and they're always on holiday, but he's never ever been to Kenya, and he works for a bank in Kenya. That is an example. So the question is not whether he should emigrate or whatever. The world is becoming the world is happening in the cloud today. Make sure you've got the necessary skills for that. And then last, there are 4 specific industries that I like. And maybe I can share that with you. The first one, I like agriculture. Agriculture, South Africa's got some particular challenges as far as agriculture is concerned. But I really do like agriculture because of technological changes happening in agriculture. The normal business model on agriculture in South Africa still is a one-man sort of business. Now, that is outdated. In future, agriculture is going to be these huge conglomerates, these huge companies. So that is the future of agriculture. But agriculture is also becoming very much technologically driven. And today you can be a geneticist or you can be a financial guru and you can still work in agriculture. So it's really quite artificial to talk about agriculture as a primary industry. It's not. It's actually also part of the service industry. But I think agriculture is going to change, and it's going to change quite dramatically. Agriculture is an amazing place to be. The second industry that I really like is education. Education is going to change, and it's changing already and quite a lot. And I think what happened during COVID, the lockdowns, that actually accelerated a new change that is happening in agriculture. The normal business plan of agriculture is that somebody will stand in front of education, is somebody will stand in front of the class and he will teach a lot of boys, because that is what it used to be for the past 1,000 years. It's only the past 100 years that we started sending girls to school, just by the way. Some countries still don't even send girls to school. So you stand in front of a class, you teach a lot of boys. That's the basic model and business model of education. Now that is changing, and it's going to change dramatically. In the future, the courses will be much shorter. Okay, you will be in a position to pick and choose whatever you want to do. It will be much more focused on skills and much less focused on qualifications, as an example. This idea of all the kids got to be the same age, that's nonsense. In future, you will have classes that consist of a number of old people and young people. That's another change in education that's happening. You will always need to make sure that you stay abreast with the most recent technological changes and so on. And the most important and most amazing part about education going forward, even the poorest countries, if you have a good internet connection, you will and you can get the best skills development in the world. That is the most amazing thing about education. Only it's provided our politicians make sure that give us access, don't try to prevent this from happening. Because quite often education is used as an ideological tool by the ineptocrats. So that's the second one. The third one that I really do like is medicine, or let's call it personalized medicine or wearables. Now this watch, for example, tells me I'm going to get sick before I know that. Now that's the future of medicine. You will wear things that tell you what is your blood oxygen levels, your blood pressure, your heart rate. It will tell you what your things like, for example, sugar levels are and all that sort of stuff. In future, you will have wearables doing that. And not only that, you will analyze your genetic composition. I've analyzed my genetic composition, my genome. I'm very proud of that. I'm 3% Neanderthal, just by the way. My wife reckons it's much higher, but I'm 3% Neanderthal. So, and I know that I've got certain characteristics, certain things in my genome that I can pick up. And in the future, I will get medicine for me that's been made for me, manufactured for me only, based on my specific genetic profile. So that's another area of huge opportunity going forward. And the fourth one is in terms of finance. Finance is going to change, and finance is changing quite dramatically. Now, there are many examples of this, but let me just pick on one. Now, I advise people to go and buy Bitcoin. Didn't expect me to say that. I advise you to go and buy Bitcoin. Go and buy 100 rands worth of Bitcoin. But, and this is two very important buts, Bitcoin is not an investment or any of the other so-called cryptocurrencies. They are not investments. And the second thing is you have to be extremely careful with your personal information, your passwords and that sort of stuff. But the reason why I advise people to do this, to go and buy Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever you want to buy, is because of the underlying technology. Go and buy it and get used to the underlying technology and send Bitcoins or whatever you decide on to one another and use it. because the world of finance is going to change, and it will be based on the blockchain technology. And that will include things like, for example, central bank digital currencies. And central bank digital currencies already exist. But this is a major danger, because a central bank digital currency, or a digital currency for that matter, is also programmable. Now, a programmable currency means that whoever is in charge of that currency may decide that, listen, you are buying too much brandy, I'm going to program your currency for your specific wallet that you can only buy food and no brandy, which is all good and well. But what if they decide you say something bad about the government, so they're going to reduce your value of your assets or your wallet by 20%, for example? Or the central bank decides they're going to lower interest rates. They limit it to 0% today, but they're going to lower it to minus 20%. You can do that with a programmable digital currency. The point is, whoever is in charge of a central bank digital currency in future will have immense power over the people in that specific country. So, and it's already happening. The Chinese, as an example, they've got the social security score system. If you say something bad about government on your Facebook, then you will get a negative mark behind your name and you can't buy a train ticket, for example. So that is Big Brother on steroids, a central bank digital currency. Fortunately, once you get things like central bank digital currencies, you can get more private sector digital currencies as well. And that's what I suspect how the world is going to look like in future. Just by the way, banks, as we know banks today, are probably going to disappear. And the function of banks will change quite completely in a central bank digital currency environment. The Reserve Bank, a week or what ago, announced that they support this new electronic, what's it called, pay chat, whatever, app. That is not a central bank digital currency, by the way, but that can eventually evolve in a central bank digital currency. So many countries got central bank digital currencies already, and I think the private sector will also come as a sort of a counterweight to the market and provide some private sector currencies as well as a counterweight. And I've got a suspicion many currencies are going to disappear over time. We've already seen a lot of currencies disappearing. A lot of European countries disappeared 20 years ago. They're talking about a lot of South American countries coming together and create the South American currency. We already have a number of countries in West Africa, on a West African franc, as an example. They don't have their own currencies. And I think small currencies like the South African rand and so on are probably going to disappear. And in future, we're going to have a few dominant central bank digital currencies in the world and a few dominant private sector digital currencies in the world as well. And there will be much more specialization. Like, for example, you park your money in Bitcoin, and you take a small piece of Bitcoin and you put it in Ethereum, as an example, to buy bread, because Bitcoin transaction costs are too expensive. So a lot of stuff will happen in the world of finance, and all of that will be very exciting. And in fact, if we stand back a little bit and see where we came from, if you go back 100,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago, even 100 years ago, and of course, we all talk about the good old days. The good old days were not good. Now, of course, it's not a straight line upwards. It's not a line like this. Every year is better. It's up and down all the time. But the overall trend for us as humans has been positive. And I'm very excited about the future, because the future in the world is going to be a future of plenty. It's going to be a future of peace, despite what we see every now and again. And it's going to be a future of real prosperity. So I'm very excited about all these changes. But what it is important for all of us is to make sure that you can participate in all these amazing things that are happening in the rest of the world. And perhaps the last comment I don't want to make. Don't break any laws, but pay as little tax as possible. Dankie dat julle na my geluister het. Can you hear me fine at the back? Yes. Okay, sure. Yeah. If there are there we back. Any questions? I'll try to get that. That's usually this. Yes, ma'am.
Gold and silver.
Gold and silver.
As a hedge as well in terms of digital currency. Just
Yeah, I don't like to invest in things like in gold and silver. There are some cases where you invest in gold, and there are 4 reasons why you may invest in gold. One is when there's very high levels of inflation in the US, because basically it's a hedge between the dollar and gold. So high inflation means the dollar loses value, then you buy gold. So we have high inflation in the US, but not very high levels of inflation. So high levels of inflation, US inflation, that's one reason. The second reason why you want to buy gold is when you want to flee, so you put a lot of gold in your pocket, you run away. That's a valid reason. The third reason why I want to invest in gold is because of some sentimental value. Okay. And the fourth reason why you want to invest in gold is to seduce women. So those are the four things. You don't invest in gold because it doesn't get more. So I don't like gold or silver for that matter. I prefer, if you want to invest in gold, rather buy gold mined shares. It's much more liquid and blah, blah, blah. So no, I know people are going to say gold is money. Yes, to an extent it is money. And I know people are going to say that the central banks in the world are mismanaging money internationally, which in a large extent is also true. But you can hedge yourself against that. You can hedge yourself against inflation, as an example, by investing in other inflation hedges that are much more liquid and much better performance and so on. So my bottom line is no, I don't like gold and silver.
So you prefer?
No. I told you, it's not an investment. Now, Bitcoin is not an investment. The reason why I buy Bitcoin is to get used to an underlying technology. Your best investment is probably some sort of diversified portfolio. Like, for example, to invest in other companies. Look for your company. Your best investment, by the way. So your first and most important investment is to invest in yourself. Make sure you have the necessary skills. Your second investment is to invest in your own company. Yeah, I mean, there's no way I can beat your investments because you understand your business. You're going to do a much better job by investing in your own company than what I'm going to do with your money. And the third investment that you do is you take some of the money off the table and you give it to somebody that you can trust to look after, because you have to diversify. So those are your three investments: yourself, your business, and then take some money off the table. Yes, ma'am.
What skills do you think is important to invest in?
What?
What skills do you think is important to invest
Good.
in and understanding how the world works?
Yes, but skills are important to invest in. We have to understand that everything is becoming more digitized. So it doesn't matter where you are. You have to be becoming more. Now, unfortunately for us in South Africa, what we actually need in South Africa is a lot more activity in the secondary part of our economy. That's factories and so on. But because of many reasons, not skills issues, for example, and some other structural issues in the economy, that part of the economy is not growing. It is only the really advanced part of the economy that is growing. But even if you're part of the secondary sector or even the primary sector that I've said, your skills need to be kind of service orientated. So to make sure, people say you don't need to become a computer expert necessarily. You don't necessarily have to be able to program stuff and so on, but be aware of that sort of stuff that is happening in your business environment, that you feel at least comfortable with that new technological changes. That makes sense. It really depends on where you are. But things are becoming more digitized, and there's huge technological changes happening all over the world. And we as South Africans are falling behind, big time. The biggest expense item in South Africa for the state is education. We spend more on education than in anything else, more in relative and absolute terms compared to the rest of most places in the rest of the world. But the outcome of our education is not only bad, it's sometimes the worst in the world. The worst in the world. So don't look at the state to provide you with proper skills development. Forget about education, skills development that matters, and make sure that you really are at the forefront of at least knowing what's going on with new and recent developments. Yes, sir.
You said invest in yourself, company, and someone else.
No, you invest in yourself, skills development. Then you start your own business or your own career then, and you invest in that. And then thirdly, once you've got that established, take some of the money off. But don't expect the guy that you give your money to, he's going to do better than you. You're going to do the best because you look after your own money, you understand your own business, your own career. But it's always important to diversify, to get some of your money to. And of course, you have to save for retirement and that sort of stuff. That's what I mean by it.
Last question.
Yes, sir?
Just a quick question. I don't think your statement that you made about social grants, you said there are about 33 million if you civil servants.
Yes.
I challenge you. I don't think that's correct to lump the civil servants in that as well. You must also remember part of them, depending on their tax brackets, they pay taxpayers.
Yes.
The other thing, there are other economists who are on the left side of you who are saying you pay social grants. Although it's consumption, on the other hand, it is a stimulus.
Yes.
And I thought you would be commenting maybe on that as well. But also, there's other metrics as well
Yes.
That research has shown things like education, things like malnutrition that's increasing because of social grants. So despite, so I think it needs to be counterbalance. Just lastly as well, I'm glad that towards the tail end of your talk, you were able to draw in some of the silver linings within it.
I do that because
Because it sounded dark a little bit.
yeah, everybody's going to jump off buildings if I don't bring up that. Now, there are some silver linings. Yes, I hear what your comments are, and I've got answers to all of that. Your argument about civil, like for example, the civil servants, I call them grant recipients mostly. Not all of them, but mostly. They are hugely overpaid and hugely underworked. If you look at the quality of South Africa's civil service, and there are many metrics to prove this. Not all of them. I want to make it very, very clear. So but if we pay all these civil servants, they are 30 million. That's what I said, not 33. 30 million of them in all. Of course, it's got a stimulatory effect on the economy. But you know, a successful social support system is the one with fewer people, not more people. And what is happening today, and I'm not against that, just by the way. I'm very much in favor of the social grants. We've got a responsibility as South Africans to make sure that our fellow South Africans don't die of hunger. But we must put things in place to get them off the social grant system. And that's the point I want to make. Okay, but all right, I think I'm done. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you. Oh,
Dankie, Dawie.
dankie.
Daar's 'n kaartjie vir hom uit te gaan.
O, do you know? Baie dankie.